2 years had passed since that day, and some memories still clung, like light shadows always nearby, even when everything around changed. Sometimes it seems to me that I can once again feel the smell of damp earth and hear the rustle of reeds on the Lake Svetlo near Kostane. That day was supposed to be just a trip to nature with my son Dima. My husband Andre, as often happened, could not go, and work consumed him completely. And over time I learned to live with his absence, to accept the silence of our suburban home as a given. Dima and I left in the morning, with our backpacks packed, when the sun had already risen high. On the way we hardly talked, but there was no need. He, 16 years old, had become more reserved, quiet, listened to music in his headphones, and looked out the window. I secretly watched him with a feeling of tenderness and light sadness. He had grown up so quickly, and it always seemed to me that time was slipping through my fingers. I tried to remember the moments, the small instants that could resist the flight of time. Arriving at the lake shore, we found a quiet place away from the other vacationers. We spread out a blanket. He stuck the sun umbrella into the ground while I unpacked the food bags. The moist air, smelling of pondweed and heated grass, filled my lungs. And for the first time in several weeks, I felt free, if only for a moment. The sun was burning, maybe even too strongly, but I did not care. I lay down and closed my eyes, allowing my thoughts to dissolve in the rustle of reeds and the splash of water. I remember talking with Dima about simple things. I said it was good to get out into the fresh air, to breathe something different. He nodded, running his fingers through his dark hair, and replied with a half smile, "You are right, Mom. This moment, however ordinary it may be, is imprinted in my memory." It seemed that some new closeness had arisen between us, quiet but tangible. There was no need for many words. It was enough just to be near. In those days, Andre's presence at home was becoming ever more ghostly. He returned late, tired. Immersed in his thoughts, he spoke little. And when he did, it was about practical things: bills, purchases, household matters. He loved Dima and our younger daughter Anya. I am sure of that. But as if his mind was somewhere else, always directed towards something I could not grasp. I often felt transparent, as if my existence was taken for granted. But that Sunday, I decided to carve out a little time for myself, at least a few hours, away from everything, and with Dima nearby, silent but present. That solitude seemed less burdensome. I did not ask him for much, only to help apply a bit of sunscreen on my back. A simple, natural request. He came, took the tube, and did as I asked. He was attentive, gentle. I was touched by the delicacy of his movements, so similar to how, in childhood, he would take my hand when crossing the street. There was a moment when I fell silent, listening only to my own breathing and the rustle of reeds. I thought about how time had changed our family. Once Andre and I used to spend evenings together, watching movies until late, or wandering aimlessly around the city. I missed that closeness. Lately our gazes rarely met, and when they did, they were empty, devoid of the light that once united us. Dima said nothing while we were packing our modest lunch. We ate silently, watching the dragonflies circling above the water. It was a peaceful silence, not oppressive. After eating, we moved closer to the water, where the sand was cooler. We talked about school, about his friends, about the books he was reading. I was struck by his maturity, by the calmness with which he perceived things. I thought that, despite everything, perhaps I was doing something right. That day stretched slowly. The sun began to sink toward the sunset, and the lake shore emptied. While gathering our things, I watched Dima carefully fold the blanket, close the umbrella, and thought about how much he had changed. He was no longer a child, and I was no longer the mother he had known. Something had transformed inside me. A feeling of unease, but also of clarity. No one was to blame. Life simply went on its course, quietly and imperceptibly, leaving invisible traces. We returned home by car with the radio playing softly. We spoke little. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the road. He sat beside me, seeming absorbed in his thoughts. But in that silence, I felt a thin, almost intangible bond between us. Maybe it was just affection, maybe simply the awareness that for at least one day, we had just been near each other. When in the evening we entered the house, it was already dark. Andre was still at work, and Anya was sleeping in her room. I unpacked our things while Dima went to his room. I stopped for a moment in the kitchen, looking at the empty table, and realized how much I missed the life we once had. Not a perfect life, but a living, sincere one. Today had been just a small step towards something I could not yet explain, but I knew that whatever happened, I would not be able to ignore it. After that trip to the lake, the days went on as usual, but something inside me could not settle into place. The thought of that day by the water constantly surfaced at unexpected moments. When I was cooking dinner, washing dishes, making the beds. It was not a clear thought, rather, a feeling. A shared silence, Dima's gaze when I talked to him, his presence nearby when we wandered along the shore. Andre also returned late that evening, placed his briefcase by the door, took off his jacket, and threw at me a tired, almost distracted glance. He pecked me on the cheek more out of habit than tenderness. Then he went to the living room to check his phone. For several seconds, I silently watched him from behind, asking myself whether he noticed my gaze. He did not. As if we were two strangers sharing one space, but no longer the same emotions. Dima, on the contrary, seemed more attentive. Not in a noisy or intrusive way, but in small gestures I had not noticed before. He helped set the table, asked whether I needed help, came into the kitchen just to drink some water. When I was there, I saw how he looked at everything with great attention, as if something inside him had changed. I tried to behave as usual, showing nothing, but inside me some tension was growing, something I could not name. One evening, after putting Anya to bed, I stayed sitting in the living room with a book in my hands, which I could not read. The words blended together, slipping from the pages. I heard Dima's approaching steps. He sat on the sofa next to me, and for several minutes we were silent. I simply closed the book and placed it on the coffee table. "Mom," he said quietly, "are you tired?" I looked at him. His eyes seemed sincerely concerned. A little. The day was long. He nodded and again stared ahead of him. I was touched by that simple gesture, that question I had not heard for a long time. No one asked me how I felt, not even Andre. I had stopped expecting such attention, convinced that with time everything would settle. But now that small gesture made me feel noticed, and it moved me more than I wanted to admit. In the following days, Dima and I talked a bit more. About books, about music, even about cooking. There were moments when we laughed together, and in such moments the house seemed less cold. Andre still kept his distance, often locking himself in his office even on weekends. Anya was happy when we managed to have dinner all together, but such moments were rare and filled with silence. One Saturday, Andre left for a meeting out of town. He said he would return on Sunday evening. I said goodbye to him without questions, already used to these sudden departures. Dima was in his room, and Anya was watching cartoons. I decided to take advantage of the good weather and suggest to Dima that we go to the lake again. I do not know what pushed me to that. Maybe the desire to breathe that damp air again. Maybe the need to escape this increasingly gray routine. Dima agreed without enthusiasm, but also without refusal. He packed his backpack, took 2 bottles of water, and we went out. On the way, he did not put on his headphones as usual. He looked out the window with a relaxed but attentive face. I drove silently, trying to put my thoughts in order. The atmosphere was calm, but I felt something moving beneath the surface, like a hidden current. The lakeshore was almost deserted when we arrived. The wind was cooler than usual, and the sky slightly veiled with haze. We settled in a secluded corner, far from the main path. Dima busied himself with the umbrella and the blankets. I sat looking at the horizon, letting the sound of the water drown all thoughts. We stayed there for about 1 hour, talking in fragments. I asked, "How are things at school? Does he need help with any subjects?" He calmly replied that everything was fine. I noticed that he was looking at me more attentively than usual. There was nothing strange in his eyes, but it seemed he wanted to understand what I felt, whether I was really there or only physically. Before returning to the car, we went to wash our feet. The public showers were almost empty. Dima went first, putting his feet under the cold water. I lingered a bit, then joined him. In that simplicity, there was something soothing. The water, the sand slowly rinsed from the skin, the even sound of the flowing water. We changed clothes, dried off, and returned to the car. On the way home, we spoke little, but the atmosphere was different from the first trip. There was no awkwardness, only a kind of mutual attention, as if we both knew that something was changing but did not understand what exactly. At home, we were met by Anya with a smile. She told us about the cartoon she had watched. Dima listened to her patiently. I cooked dinner. The evening passed quietly, without upheavals, but when going to bed I could not fall asleep for a long time. I tossed in bed, staring at the ceiling. Andre was not beside me. Dima in the neighboring room was still reading. I heard the soft rustle of turning pages. I closed my eyes, trying to drive away my thoughts. There was nothing wrong in what had happened. We were just mother and son spending time together. But it was precisely the absence, the emptiness left by Andre that pressed upon me. That emptiness was only occasionally filled with simple gestures, small signs of kindness that Dima, it seemed, now noticed more than anyone else. I do not know what I expected from all this. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the possibility to feel again part of something. Something that would be not only duty, but also attention, presence, understanding. The night passed slowly, and listening to the distant sounds of the sleeping house, I repeated to myself that everything would be fine. One just needs to keep moving carefully, not to force anything. One just needs to remain alert in heart and thoughts, at least for now. After that weekend, the days passed in seeming calm, but inside me I felt that something had changed, though I still could not define it. Dima behaved as usual, but with greater attentiveness, with gestures that now touched me more than before, as if he wanted to make sure that I was all right, as if he felt the fragility that I myself could barely admit. One evening, while I was washing the dishes in the kitchen, I heard his footsteps behind me. He often came to me at such moments, but this time he stopped closer than usual. Silently, he put a plate on the rack and stayed standing, saying nothing. I continued slowly, almost mechanically, wiping a glass. "Help?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "Almost done, but thank you." A short silence followed. Then he added, "You are tired today, Mom." I barely turned, a little surprised, but nothing special. He nodded, as if taking note, then stepped away, leaving me with a strange feeling. It was not awkwardness, but something more subtle. Awareness, perhaps, or simply the fact that my teenage son had become more attentive than I could have imagined. That night I slept poorly. I tossed in the empty bed. Andre was again on a business trip, and the silence of the house felt heavier than usual. Every quiet sound seemed amplified. The ticking of the clock, the wind rustling behind the blinds, even the light breathing of Anya from her room. I asked myself how we had come to this. A husband who drifted farther away, and a son who silently filled the space that did not belong to him. It was not a matter of guilt. There were no guilty ones, only absence. And perhaps in the midst of that absence, new unexpected connections were forming, not always logical, but genuine. The next day I tried to focus on simple things: take Anya to school, go for groceries, tidy the house. Dima was studying, Andre was still out of town. Returning from the store, I found a handwritten note on the kitchen table. "Back soon. We'll stop by the library first." I took it in my hands and reread it several times, as if trying to find a hidden meaning between the lines. In the afternoon, when he came back, he stopped in the doorway and greeted me with a barely noticeable smile. His face had a new expression. Calmer. We talked for several minutes about the books he had taken from the library. Then he went upstairs to his room. I remained sitting on the sofa, suddenly feeling a wave of sweet melancholy. During the week, I'd tried to keep myself occupied. I invited an old friend for coffee, sorted old boxes of photographs, took up again a book I had long put aside. But even among these small, everyday things, my thoughts kept returning to that feeling that had accompanied me for several days. Dima's presence in my life was becoming more and more significant. More than was right. One Sunday afternoon, when Anya was sleeping on the sofa and Andre was again locked in his office, Dima asked whether I wanted to take a walk. I gladly agreed, wishing to breathe fresh air. We went out without a goal, walking along the quiet streets of our neighborhood. The leaves on the trees were beginning to change color, heralding the coming of autumn. We talked about the weather, about school, about the series we had watched together several months earlier. Nothing particularly deep, but every word carried a different weight. Every pause seemed filled with something neither of us wanted to name. We stopped in a small park and sat on a bench. Dima looked at me for a long time without saying a word. I looked away, staring at a point between the trees. "Mom," he said quietly, "are you lonely?" That question struck me like a gust of cold wind. I had not expected it, but it was exactly what I had asked myself 1,000 times without ever truly answering. "Sometimes, yes," I replied honestly, "but it's all right." Dima said nothing more, but his silence spoke for itself. After a few minutes, we stood up and walked home. The rest of the day passed calmly. Andre came out of his office only for dinner, speaking about work as if it were the only possible topic. Anya talked about school. I listened. Dima watched. That evening before going to bed, I went into Anya's room to wish her good night. She was sleeping soundly. Her face was serene. I looked at her for a long time, wondering how she managed to preserve something so pure amid all these invisible cracks. Leaving, I met Dima in the hallway. Our eyes met for a moment. Then he smiled slightly and whispered, "Good night, Mom." "Good night, dear," I replied. I returned to my room and slowly closed the door. I sat on the bed, folding my hands on my knees. The unspoken words of that day circled in my head like leaves driven by the wind. It was obvious that something was drawing us closer, but I did not yet know whether it was need, affection, or simply the desire to be seen. In the gestures, in the dialogues, in the silences, there was nothing wrong. But I began to understand that certain connections, even those born innocently, can become complicated if not clarified. I decided that I would find a way to restore balance in my life. It was not right to continue seeking understanding only where it was easiest to find. I needed to restore my relationship with Andre, to talk, to try. I told myself that perhaps the time had come to change something, but that thought alone frightened me, because to change means to risk losing. And at that moment, I was not sure I was ready for that. Autumn had finally taken full possession of its rights, and the house was filled with that special silence that accompanies short days. The lights stayed on longer, the rain often tapped against the windows, and everything around moved with a new, almost contemplative slowness. Andre remained distant, even when physically present. His conversations concerned only work, tasks, problems that needed solving. I listened to him, nodded, but inside I felt that we were drifting farther and farther apart. Not because of hostility or indifference, but because of that quiet distance that grows over time when two people stop truly seeking each other. Dima, on the contrary, had become a constant presence. He helped around the house, cared for his sister, and with me was attentive, respectful, at times even gentle. I noticed his looks, his silences, and tried to interpret every gesture rationally. "It's just care," I told myself. "Nothing more." The truth was that every bit of attention, every kind word, touched me more deeply than I wanted to admit. One evening, when we were clearing the table after dinner, Andre had left for a business meeting, and Anya, already in her pajamas, was watching television. Dima and I ended up in the kitchen. He was drying the dishes while I washed them. The sound of water filled the empty spaces of conversation. "Do you remember when we used to go to the playground?" he suddenly asked. I smiled. "Of course. You ran everywhere, and I could hardly keep up." "Everything seemed simpler then," he said. I nodded. "For me, at least, yes. But maybe I was just younger." For a moment, we looked at each other. In the air hung a shared melancholy, as if we both knew something was changing, but neither of us wanted to say it aloud. It was a suspended moment, but without tension. Just awareness. A few similar days passed. School, work, home. Sometimes Dima and I ended up in the same room, reading in silence. Sometimes we cooked together, experimenting with new recipes. Every gesture seemed an effort to build something calm and stable. But I kept asking myself whether it was right to rely so much on my son's closeness. whether I should instead turn toward Andre, the one who had drifted so far away. One Sunday, when Anya was at her grandparents' and Andre was locked in his office, Dima and I went for a walk outside the city. The air was fresh, the sky gray. We walked for a long time in silence, listening only to the rustle of leaves beneath our feet. "Are you all right?" he asked after a while. I stopped to look at him. "Yes, I think so." "You don't smile as often as you used to, you know," he said quietly. His words touched me. I hadn't noticed, but he was right. I had forgotten how to smile at something real and spontaneous, not out of politeness, not to hide. I smiled at him then, sincerely, and he smiled back. We returned home after dark. The evening passed without incident, but I felt I was approaching a turning point. I needed to do something, to talk to Andre, perhaps to restore balance. I could no longer live in such an uncertain emotional space. A few days later, I gathered my courage. One evening after dinner, I asked Andre to sit with me in the living room. He was surprised. We hadn't talked like that in a long time. "Is something wrong, Lena?" he asked. "Yes, but it's not something simple. It's time. The way we've lost each other without realizing it." He lowered his eyes, silent for a few minutes, then said, "I know I work too much, but it's for us." "It's not enough to say it's for us anymore," I answered. "Andre, I need you here, beside me, like before. I feel lonely." It was a difficult moment. We talked for a long time, not arguing, but honestly. He listened, and I spoke. We didn't solve everything that evening, but at least we began, and that already meant something. After that conversation, I tried to create more space for us, for the family. I suggested we have dinner together at least twice a week without distractions. I began involving Anya and Dima in small shared moments. It wasn't easy, but it was sincere. Dima sensed that something had changed. He became a bit quieter, more reserved, but not cold, just respectful. It seemed he understood that I was trying to regain control over my life, and he accepted it with the same maturity he had always shown. One evening, he left a note on my nightstand. "I love you, Mom. Whatever happens." I held it tightly in my hands, moved to tears. It was a simple message, but full of meaning. He knew, and I knew, that despite everything, we had gone through a hard moment together. Spring was approaching, bringing a sense of new beginnings. Not everything was resolved, but something had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a desire to start over. One morning, I woke to strange silence. Outside, everything was white. The first snow had fallen. Large flakes were slowly swirling, covering the ground with a pure blanket. Down below, on the snowy street, I saw Dima's figure. He stood with his head tilted back, watching the falling snow. He was wearing only a thin shirt. His dark hair was tousled. I don't know why, but the sight made my heart beat faster. There was something fragile and strong about it at once. I quickly put on my robe and went downstairs. "Dima, what are you doing?" I asked softly. He turned to me, and in his eyes I saw a strange expression, a mix of thoughtfulness and something I couldn't define. "It's beautiful," he simply said, lifting his gaze back to the sky. A snowflake slowly melted on his cheek. I stepped closer and felt a cold, soft crystal glide down my arm. We stood there for several minutes, silently watching the first snow. In that silence, there was something intimate, something that connected us beyond words. After that morning, something imperceptible changed in our family. My conversations with Andre became more open, though the tension hadn't fully disappeared. We tried to spend more time together, going to the cinema, sometimes dining out. It seemed a fragile truce had come. Dima became more reserved, as if stepping slightly aside, observing us. There was sometimes sadness in his gaze, but he said nothing. One evening, when Andre stayed late at work and Anya was already asleep, Dima came into the kitchen. I was finishing my tea, scrolling the news on my tablet. He silently sat across from me. We spent a few minutes in silence, then he cleared his throat and said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I put the tablet aside and looked at him. His face was serious, even tense. "What happened, Dima?" I asked, feeling a growing unease inside. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. Do you remember that first trip to the lake? I nodded. That day I felt something strange, something I didn't understand and couldn't name. His voice trembled slightly. It's been on my mind ever since. I felt my heart tighten. Dima, we don't have to talk about this now, I said quietly, trying to stay calm. He looked down, whispering, I'm sorry if it ever hurt you. I just wanted to be honest. At that moment, the front door opened. Andre came in. He smiled tiredly at us both. What's so serious in here? He asked, taking off his jacket. Dima turned quickly. His face was pale. I felt my chest tighten. Words stuck in my throat. I didn't know how to explain the tension hanging in the air. Andre looked from me to Dima, sensing that something was wrong. And then Dima spoke words that froze everything. Dad, I love her. The world collapsed around me. Andre's face twisted in shock and anger. I felt ice seize my heart. Everything we had tried to rebuild turned to dust. What would happen next? Andre's rage, my shame, our guilt, hung over us like a thread ready to break at any moment.